We can't invade without a port. Then build one. Winston Churchill, May 30th, 1942. The war room was deep beneath Whitehall, sealed under layers of concrete and cigarette smoke. Maps covered every wall, the blue-gray veins of Europe threaded with red pins, black arrows, and thin circles of chalk that marked what couldn't be reached. The lights flickered with each distant thud from the Luftwaffe above, dust sifting from the ceiling like ash. It was past midnight. The men around the long oak table looked exhausted. Their uniforms were creased, their voices hoarse from months of planning. They had crossed and recrossed the channel 100 times on paper, and each time the same problem ended the conversation. No port. France's northern coast was a fortress. Calais, Boulogne, Cherbourg, every harbor mined, defended, and pointed straight at England. The beaches of Normandy were open sand and shallow tides. You could land men, perhaps tanks, but you couldn't keep them fed, fueled, or alive without a harbor to offload the millions of tons of supplies an invasion demanded. A colonel finally broke the silence. "Sir, taking a port like Calais will cost us 100,000 men." The room was still. Churchill sat motionless, his cigar unlit, eyes half in shadow. "Then, slowly," he said, "then we'll take our own ports with us." At first, there was confusion, then nervous laughter. A few of the older officers looked away, as if embarrassed by the absurdity. Build a harbor? Tow it across the sea? Madness. But one man, an engineer from the Admiralty named Bruce White, didn't laugh. He reached for a pencil, pushed aside an empty teacup, and began sketching directly on the table. The Prime Minister watched him. "Can it be done?" White didn't look up. "It has to be, sir." By dawn, the corridors outside the war room were alive with whispers. The phrase spread like a riddle through the ministries: floating harbor, portable port, artificial bay. Most dismissed it as rumor. But in a locked file marked most secret, Operation Mulberry, the impossible had already begun. Within days, teams of naval architects and civil engineers were summoned to London under false names. They were told only that the project concerned temporary marine structures for future operations. No one said where or why. Meetings took place in windowless basements, chalk dust hanging in the air, draftsmen sketching vast breakwaters on scraps of brown paper. They argued about wave height, about tides, about how to anchor a city to the sea. One note from those early sessions survives: the channel is no friend. If we build it, it must endure storms. Outside, the blitz continued. Whole streets vanished overnight, the sky glowing orange as the sirens wailed. Yet beneath that chaos, in hidden workshops and half-empty factories, a handful of men were beginning to imagine something no one had ever attempted: a harbor that could float, detach, sail, and rebuild itself on the far shore of war. They spoke of sections the size of cathedrals, hollow concrete giants that could be sunk or raised at will, roads that floated, bridges that bent with the tide, anchors heavier than locomotives. They called the pieces phoenixes, whales, spuds, beetles, code names meant to sound like nonsense, masking the birth of the most ambitious engineering project in military history. And through it all, Churchill pressed them. "Do not tell me it can't be done," he thundered during one midnight briefing. "Tell me how fast you can finish it." To most of the war cabinet, it still sounded like desperation, the product of a man who refused to accept geography. But to the engineers, it was a challenge unlike any they had known. They weren't building weapons. They were building a bridge between continents, a highway for liberation. In the months that followed, quiet orders spread across Britain's coast. Old shipyards in Southampton and Portsmouth reopened overnight. New slipways appeared in Welsh harbors. Rail depots in Scotland filled with steel beams longer than any train could carry. All of it labeled only Mulberry. The secrecy was absolute. Workers were told nothing beyond their assigned dimensions. One man welded for 3 months before realizing the section he was building wasn't part of a dockyard at all. It was part of a wall that would one day hold back the English Channel. To the military strategists, the plan defied every law of war. You couldn't build a harbor that floated. You couldn't assemble one under fire. And you certainly couldn't expect it to survive the channel's tempests. But to the few who believed, the logic was simple. They didn't need the impossible to work forever, only long enough. Long enough for the first wave to land, for the first supplies to unload, for a foothold to become a beachhead, and a beachhead to become Europe. A single line from the project directive captured the madness and the hope. Harbors to be assembled at sea, operational within 14 days of landing. No one had any idea if it would work. But by then, war had already demanded too many impossibilities to stop now. They were told to build a harbor that could float and survive a storm in the middle of a war. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. They needed a port the size of Dover, built in pieces, in secret, and ready to sail by June. In the winter of 1942, the southern coast of England became one vast construction yard. From the cliffs of Cornwall to the shipyards of Kent, every harbor, every inlet, every stretch of beach hummed with the sound of hammers and rivets. No one knew exactly what they were building, only that it was urgent, that it was secret, and that failure was not an option. The official documents gave nothing away. The orders came stamped, most secret, and filled with code names that meant nothing to the men who read them. Phoenix, Whale, Beetle, Spud. Some thought they were new landing craft. Others joked they were building a bridge to Germany. But the truth was more audacious than anyone guessed. They were constructing a floating harbor large enough to feed an army. Over 40 companies were enlisted, spread across Britain's coast. More than 45,000 workers, shipwrights, welders, carpenters, miners, and draftsmen worked day and night in blackout conditions. Concrete was poured by the ton, steel bent and welded until the air itself smelled of metal. Each Phoenix caisson, the backbone of the harbor, was a hollow block 6 stories high and weighing 6,000 tons. They were built in dry docks, then flooded and towed to secret anchorages along the coast, waiting for the call to move. In the factories, posters reminded the workers, "Loose lips sink ships." But no one knew what ship they were sinking. Rumors filled the void. Some said it was a plan to build offshore fuel tanks. Others, that it was a weapon to block the U-boat lanes. Few realized they were assembling the foundation of an invasion. Alan Beckett, a young Royal Engineers officer, kept a small notebook filled with sketches. His task was to design the flexible floating roadways, the whales, that would connect the shore to the anchored platforms offshore. Each section had to survive waves, currents, and constant movement without breaking. He tested his models in a wave tank in southern England, dropping pebbles into the water to simulate the roughness of the channel. "We didn't build docks," he would later say. "We built hope, section by section." But hope was fragile. One February morning in 1943, a half-finished Phoenix unit at Garleyston cracked under its own weight. The structure split open, concrete slabs collapsing into the freezing water. The crane that stood above it toppled, dragging men into the bay. 3 were killed, several others never found. For a moment, the project stood still, thousands of tons of steel frozen midair, the sound of construction replaced by silence. That night, Beckett wrote a line in his journal, "We are trying to build permanence out of water." The following week, they tried again. This time, they reinforced the joints, adjusted the buoyancy chambers, recalculated the moorings. The next model held, then another. Soon the prototypes began to behave like living things, rising and falling with the tide, flexing against the wind, carrying trucks and tanks across the artificial waves. In a secluded bay in Scotland, far from any city, the Royal Engineers built a full-scale mock-up of the Mulberry Harbor. It was a secret within a secret, a miniature version of the invasion to come. They tested every detail, the floating bridges, the pierheads that rose and fell, the breakwaters that tamed the waves. Observers stood in heavy coats, notebooks in hand, watching as the sea battered the structure hour after hour. At dusk, when the sky turned violet and the water shimmered like oil, one of the test platforms refused to sink. It rode the storm through the night, half submerged but still intact. At dawn, the senior officer turned to his men and said quietly, "Gentlemen, we've just built a city that floats." Word spread through the engineering corps, not officially, but through glances, through the quiet pride of men who knew they were part of something extraordinary. They had built bridges that could sail, piers that could anchor themselves, roads that could bend without breaking. It was the largest modular construction in human history, and yet no newspaper ever mentioned it. Every few weeks, officials from the Admiralty visited the coastal sites. They came in unmarked cars, walked among the workers without introductions, and left before anyone could ask questions. One of them, a civilian with a clipped accent, carried a single note signed by Churchill himself. The harbors must be ready before the army can be. See that they are. By early 1944, 2 entire harbors existed, not in one place, but scattered across Britain like the pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. Each consisted of over 2,000 components: floating roads, piers, pontoons, anchors, and massive concrete breakwaters. Together, they would form 2 artificial ports, Mulberry A for the Americans off Omaha Beach and Mulberry B for the British near Arromanches. The sea trials began in March. Tugboats towed the caissons down the coast in convoys that stretched for miles, silent gray monoliths gliding through fog like ghosts. Fishermen watched from their boats, bewildered, as the giant blocks slid past in the dawn mist. To them, it looked as if England itself were breaking apart and drifting toward France. When the test succeeded, the final order was given: hold for Operation Neptune, launch upon signal of invasion. No one knew when that signal would come, only that when it did, the harbors would have to move fast, before the Germans could react, before the weather could turn. Each section was tagged, numbered, and chained to moorings like racehorses waiting for release. The engineers had done the impossible. They had taken Churchill's midnight dream and hammered it into steel and concrete. They had built 2 entire ports in secret, hidden beneath the routine noise of war. By June 1944, Britain had 2 entire harbors waiting, each big enough to feed an army. Imagine an entire city, breaking off from the coast of England and sailing toward France. June 1st, 1944. The sea was black glass under a low, bruised sky. Along the southern coast of England, hundreds of ships lay hidden in the mist, tugboats, barges, and strange floating structures with no names. The wind smelled of diesel, salt, and rain. To anyone watching from shore, it looked like the island itself was unmooring, piece by piece, and setting out to sea. For months, these hulking shapes had waited in secret anchorages, the Mulberries. 2 of them, codenamed A and B, were about to become the lifeline of the greatest invasion in history. Each was a floating harbor, 10 kilometers long, made of over 2,000 pieces of steel and concrete. They had no flag, no nationality, and no precedent. As the tide turned, signal lamps blinked across the water. Tugs roared to life, cables groaned, and the giant caissons began to move. Massive, hollow blocks 6 stories high, gliding like silent fortresses toward the channel. Behind them followed pontoon bridges, floating roads, pierheads, and breakwaters. It was not a fleet, but an armada of architecture, a harbor on the move. A young Royal Navy lieutenant, standing on the deck of a tug, wrote in his logbook. It looked like the whole of Britain was on the move. They sailed at night, under blackout orders, their navigation lights masked. The sea was rough, the sky threatening rain. Men slept in their uniforms, boots on, unsure whether they were heading into history or suicide. Over the radio, code names replaced locations. Wales Section 14, Phoenix 22, Spud Pier North. Each piece had its role, its destination, its moment to arrive. 2 harbors for 2 armies. Mulberry A, bound for Omaha Beach, to serve the Americans. Mulberry B, bound for Arromanches, to serve the British. By June 6th, D-Day, the beaches of Normandy were chaos, fire, smoke, and humanity colliding in waves. The harbors were still at sea, waiting for the go signal. When it came, the order was a single word: sail. Convoys spread out across the channel. The horizon disappeared under the scale of it. Thousands of vessels, from warships to fishing boats, all converging on France. The sea boiled with movement. Above them, clouds hung heavy with the threat of storm. Below, men whispered prayers into the dark. When the first caissons reached the French coast, they were guided into position by engineers under enemy fire. Some of the blocks ran aground too soon and cracked. Others drifted in the current and had to be dragged back by tugs straining at their cables. Still, one by one, they were sunk into place with controlled explosions, forming a long, curved wall against the open sea. Behind it, the floating roads and platforms were connected, steel fingers stretching toward the beaches, ready to receive the lifeblood of the invasion. A voice crackled over the radio. Harbor sections are afloat. The invasion is moving. By nightfall, the first ships were unloading cargo, ammunition, food, fuel, tanks, all onto a coastline that, only days before, had been enemy territory. The men worked by moonlight, waist-deep in surf, shouting over the roar of engines and the rattle of gunfire in the distance. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the impossible had been mastered. The floating harbors held steady. Trucks rolled ashore, soldiers cheered, and officers in drenched uniforms shook hands on the piers they had built in secret. The beachhead was growing. Then, on June 19th, the weather turned. It began with wind, steady, then rising. The waves grew taller, the rain colder. By night, the channel was a fury of black water and foam. The mulberries strained against their moorings, the flexible bridges twisting like snakes. Steel screamed against steel. At dawn, a wave taller than a house slammed into the American harbor at Omaha. The caissons cracked, the pontoon roads tore free, and the whole structure began to collapse. Men clung to the wreckage, shouting into the wind as pieces of the harbor broke apart and vanished beneath the waves. For 3 days the storm raged. When it cleared, Mulberry A was gone, scattered across the seafloor. Mulberry B, the British harbor at Arromanches, had survived, barely. Damaged, battered, but intact enough to continue. It became the sole artery feeding the Allied advance for months, handling more than 2 million men and 500,000 vehicles before the war was done. But that morning, as the storm rolled away and the sun rose over the ruins of Omaha Beach, the sea was littered with the ghosts of what they had built, fragments of a city that had tried to float through a war. The engineers stood on the shore, staring at the horizon in silence. One of them muttered, almost to himself, "We built a harbor strong enough for an army, but not for the sea." The sea had other plans. And within days, one of the floating cities had vanished beneath the waves. On June 19th, 1944, the sea turned on them. 16 days after the landings, Normandy was supposed to be stable. The beaches were secure, the front lines pushing inland. The floating harbors, those impossible, miraculous cities of steel and concrete, were finally doing their job. For the first time, supplies were pouring in faster than the Germans could destroy them. Soldiers joked that even the sea had joined the Allies. And then the sea changed its mind. It began with a wind out of the west, steady at first, then howling. By evening, it was a full gale. Waves rose like walls. The rain came sideways, cold and punishing, stinging like shrapnel. The barometers fell faster than anyone had seen in years. By midnight, the English Channel had turned into a weapon. On the horizon, the mulberries strained against their anchors. The concrete caissons, those 6,000-ton phoenixes, began to rise and fall, crashing into one another with a sound like thunder under the water. The flexible whale bridges buckled, twisting in the foam. Trucks slid into the sea. Barges snapped their moorings and vanished into the darkness. A sailor from the U.S. Navy later wrote, "The sea tore the harbor apart like it hated the very idea of it." The storm lasted 3 days. 80-kilometer winds hammered the coast. Visibility was near zero. Engineers tried to secure the sections with chains, shouting orders that no one could hear over the roar. One man tied himself to a pontoon and worked until the cable tore free, flinging him into the surf. Others hauled ropes through waist-deep water, desperate to hold onto the collapsing roads. Every hour, another section was lost. A radio operator at Omaha Beach sent message after message into static. Mulberry, a sustaining heavy damage. Break. Request immediate assistance. No reply. The lines were dead. By the second day, the floating docks began to sink. Some of the giant concrete caissons cracked clean in half, their interiors flooding. Each weighed more than a battleship, yet the waves tossed them like toys. One American engineer, standing on the remains of a bridge, watched helplessly as an entire pier disappeared into the sea. He wrote in his notebook, water dripping down the page, "We built this thing to fight men, not God." Out at anchor, ships were breaking free. Cargo vessels collided in the storm, masts splintering. 21 ships went down before the wind eased. The survivors could only watch as years of planning, millions of tons of steel, and a dream that had once felt immortal disintegrated before their eyes. At 2 a.m. on the third night, the rain stopped. The wind softened to a whisper. All that remained was wreckage, twisted pontoons, overturned barges, the jagged tops of the Phoenix caissons jutting out of the surf like gravestones. The air was eerily calm. You could hear the waves lapping against the ruins, gentle now, almost apologetic. In the command tent above Omaha Beach, the radio finally crackled. A tired voice came through. Mulberry lost. Completely lost. The words spread across the camp like a funeral bell. The American harbor, the one built to feed the entire Western Front, was gone. Men who had landed on D-Day, who had survived machine guns and mines, now sat on the sand in silence, staring at the sea that had beaten them without firing a shot. For a moment, it seemed the invasion itself might collapse. Without the harbor, there would be no steady flow of reinforcements, no way to sustain the momentum. Every tank, every truck, every bullet had been counting on Mulberry. Now, it was just debris. On the British side, near Arromanches, the storm had done its worst, but somehow, the second harbor still stood. Half broken, battered, but alive. The breakwaters had held just enough. The engineers there, exhausted, soaked to the bone, refused to give up. They patched holes with anything they could find: sandbags, planks, scrap metal. The radio reports from the British sector came in halting, uncertain, but hopeful. Damage severe, operational capability limited, harbor still afloat. A young corporal, staring at the wreckage around him, turned to his officer and said, "Why did one live and not the other?" The officer just shook his head. Because one prayed harder. For the next several days, teams from both armies scavenged what they could from the American ruins. The sea was calm again, but the air felt different, reverent, almost afraid. The soldiers worked in silence, towing broken bridges and salvaging usable pontoons. No one spoke of rebuilding the lost harbor. They all knew it was gone forever. Still, among the wreckage, a strange determination began to stir. The British engineers at Arromanches had seen what the sea could do and what it could spare. They swore it wouldn't happen again. If nature wanted a fight, they would give it one. But that would come later. For now, the beaches were littered with fragments of a dream, an empire of concrete, born in secret, destroyed in a storm. The miracle had lasted 16 days. The sea had turned on them. But one harbor still stood. Battered, half broken, but alive. The Americans lost their port. The British refused to lose theirs. At Arromanches, the sea was still heaving with debris when the engineers began to rebuild. The storm had twisted the floating roads, torn the moorings, and shattered half the caissons. But the British command gave no order to abandon it. Instead, the message that went out was simple: hold it together, whatever it takes. The harbor was no longer an experiment or a symbol. It was survival. Every bullet, every ration, every drop of fuel for the army pushing through France would have to pass through these half-broken bones of steel and concrete. The invasion depended on a city that no longer had the strength to stand, so men decided they would stand for it. Royal engineers, sailors, and civilian builders from across England worked shoulder to shoulder in the surf. The wind was still sharp, the rain unrelenting, but the air buzzed with a stubborn energy. They hammered, welded, patched, and prayed. The whale floating roadways were dragged back into place by hand. Pontoon sections that had drifted miles down the coast were recovered by tugs, repaired, and reattached. The great caissons, some cracked, some half-submerged, were pumped out and refloated, one by one. Lieutenant Harold Jennings of the Royal Engineers wrote in his diary, "We built this harbor twice, once in England and once in hell." Day and night, the work continued under artillery fire and the lingering storms. Men slept where they stood, their faces blackened with oil and salt. The harbor's code name, Mulberry B, had been reduced to a letter scratched into metal, but the soldiers began calling it something else: Port Winston. It was half joke, half prayer, as if naming it after their prime minister could make it indestructible. When word of the reconstruction reached the Americans, they sent men and material from the wreck of Mulberry to help. Damaged pontoons were hauled across the channel, the remains of the lost harbor reborn in the British one. American welders joined British engineers on the decks, working side by side under makeshift floodlights. Together, they dragged the floating bridges into alignment, shouting over the surf, chain by chain, section by section. An officer from the Royal Navy stood on the edge of a broken pier, soaked to the bone, barking orders through a megaphone. "Hold her steady. This city feeds Europe," he shouted, and the phrase stuck. The city that fed Europe. By June 24th, just 4 days after the storm, the harbor was operating again. The first Liberty ships edged into the repaired piers, unloading tanks, ammunition, and food directly onto the floating roadways. Convoys of trucks rolled from ship to shore without pause. Each tide brought more supplies, more men, more proof that the impossible could be rebuilt. From the beach, the sight was unreal. A city of cranes and platforms rising from the waves, lit by flares and lanterns, echoing with the sound of engines and voices. The air smelled of salt, fuel, and hope. In the months that followed, the numbers grew beyond belief. Between June and August 1944, over 2.5 million soldiers, 500,000 vehicles, and nearly 4 million tons of cargo passed through Mulberry Bay. The harbor pulsed day and night, feeding the armies that broke through Normandy, crossed France, and marched toward Paris. An American captain watching the operation wrote in a letter home, "If you want to see what victory looks like, don't look at the battle, look at the docks." By July, the harbor at Arromanches had become the busiest port in the world. Every 20 minutes, a new ship docked. Every hour, thousands of tons of supplies rolled inland. And all of it, every plank, every bolt, every link in the chain, had been built by men who refused to give up. The engineers never forgot the storm. They could feel its ghost in every wave that slapped against the caissons. But they had learned something greater, that even when the sea destroys, human hands can rebuild. On quiet nights, when the work paused for a moment and the tide rose under the moon, the harbor creaked like a living thing, the last survivor of an impossible dream. By July, the harbor at Arromanches was the busiest port in the world, and it didn't even exist a month before. When you walk the beaches of Normandy today, you can still see them, the bones of a city that once floated. At low tide, they rise from the surf like ancient ruins, vast blocks of concrete, half buried in sand, their edges softened by 70 years of waves. The gulls perch on them now. Children climb them without knowing what they were. But if you listen, when the wind moves right, you can almost hear the echo of engines, the rattle of chains, the low thrum of a harbor that fed a continent. Mulberry Bay, the British harbor at Arromanches, survived for 10 months. It endured storms, shellfire, and tides until the spring of 1945, when the war had already moved east and the world no longer needed floating cities. By then, it had handled more than 60% of all Allied supplies in France, millions of men, machines, and tons of ammunition that pushed across Europe and crushed the Reich. It began as a sketch on Churchill's desk, an impossible idea born in desperation, and ended as the backbone of victory. When the last ships sailed for Germany, the harbor was left behind, too damaged and too tired to move. The engineers dismantled what they could, towing away the smaller pontoons and bridges, but the great Phoenix caissons were left to sink where they stood. They became part of the coast, the sea reclaiming them inch by inch. In his post-war memoirs, Churchill would call Mulberry the boldest engineering idea of the war. He wasn't exaggerating. It had turned the tide of the greatest invasion in history, not with guns or tanks, but with design, labor, and will. A British engineer, looking back decades later, wrote, "We didn't just build a harbor. We built the bridge between tyranny and freedom." That bridge began in English mud and ended in the liberation of a continent. It was carried not by generals, but by welders, crane operators, and men who worked in rain so cold their hands bled through their gloves. Some never saw what their work became. They died believing they were building nothing more than docks. An American officer who came through the port in August 1944 remembered it differently. "We called it the floating city of hope," he said, "because it was the first thing we saw that told us we could win." Today, the sea around Arromanches is calm. The tide rolls over the old concrete walls with a sound like breathing. Locals say the water there is warmer, though no one knows why. Some of the original harbor pieces still serve a purpose, protecting the town from storms, just as they once shielded the landing craft from the channel's fury. Standing on the shore, it's hard to imagine the scale of what once happened here. 2 artificial ports built in secret, dragged across the sea, assembled under fire, and kept alive through will alone. Nothing in history matches it, and perhaps nothing ever will. There is no monument grand enough for it, no single statue to hold its story. The harbor itself was the memorial, a city that appeared from the mist, worked its miracle, and then quietly sank back into the sea. For the soldiers who passed through, it was simply the gateway to another battle. For the engineers who built it, it was proof that even in the darkest years of war, human invention could be an act of defiance, a way of saying that destruction would not have the last word. It didn't look like victory. It looked like survival made of steel and salt. When the tide covers the ruins, the sea takes them back, as if hiding the secret again, the secret that saved Europe. They said you can't build cities on water. Britain did, and changed the course of history.